So today on Econ Nerds Live, we have a interview with Price Fishback, who's an eminent economic historian. We talk about some of the myths from the Great Depression that have been propagated over the years. So we talk about Hoover and what he did, whether the New Deal was Keynesian. And then at the end, we actually talk about a sort of more recent myth that has gained prevalence about the HOLC and its redlining maps. So very fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. It gets very econ nerdy in points, but I think that's a plus. So without further ado, I give you Price Fishback. Welcome, Price. Welcome to Econ Nerds Live, although this is not live. I don't know why we call it Econ Nerds Live, but we call it Econ Nerds Live to differentiate from the produced videos. So you are a professor at Arizona, right?
Yep, exactly. So
And
I'm a
so
Regents.
maybe just to give people a little bit of background, why did you get interested in economics?
I was going to be a history major when I went to college, and then I started out, and I'd taken calculus in high school, and they put me in the same calculus course again, and so I learned a lot about calculus. I learned it really well the second time, and became a math major. And then I took an economics course in the second year, and Robert Heilbronner had this book about the worldly philosophers, about all like Adam Smith and Malthus and all those guys. I'm reading all these biographies of those guys. I thought, well, that's what economics is. So I became an economics major. And I didn't realize it was mostly models and stuff, but I really liked how eclectic these guys were. So that's how I got in there.
It's mostly math. Especially, this first couple of years of graduate school. So
yeah, well, that wasn't the worldly philosophers' view of things.
Right. Well, back in the day, the
That's
Adam
right,
Smith and back then. And you've sort of chosen to focus on the Great Depression, and maybe, well,
Really
I guess
more
your
the New
initial,
Deal.
the New Deal, but your initial work was on coal miners, right?
Correct. Yeah. So I wrote about coal miners, about what the labor markets were like for coal miners in the early 1900s during the big booms. And then Sean Cantor and I started writing about the origins of workers' comp laws. And that was a lot of fun. And then Sean found all this amazing data in every county about what they were spending for the New Deal. And so he asked me to join him. And then we started into all these kind of things. And so we've been working on it for probably about 27 years, and I've written way too many papers. We need to write the book. So
there is, but you have like a compilation book on the Great Depression though, right? Or
no, I have a compilation, like an article that's in the Journal of Economic Literature. That's a really long article. But we haven't put together a book that compiles everything. So we need to do that.
All right. Yeah. So I thought today it'd be fun to just go through the common myths of the Great Depression that people have, maybe not in the profession, but just sort of out there. So I asked you to prepare some myths for us. So I guess we could just dive in and see what you have.
Okay. So myth number one is that, everybody talks about how Hoover just sat on his hands and didn't do anything except ask for people to volunteer to try to solve the Great Depression. And he did ask for people to volunteer to try to solve the Great Depression, but he also spent a bunch of money. And so he just didn't get credit for the money he's spending. Between 1929 and 1932, he raised federal spending by 88%. Now, if you looked at the previous 10 years or so before that, they were coming off of World War II. That expenditure was flat as a pancake. Okay, so he took this flat line and suddenly just increased it a bunch. The biggest growth that Roosevelt had in a 3-year period was 69%. So he actually spent a lot of money. Now, one thing about Roosevelt was starting with a bigger base. So the numbers were bigger just because he's starting where Hoover left him, right? And so one reason that Hoover doesn't get credit for this is because he didn't spend a lot of money between in the year 1933. Now, 1933 is a Hoover year because Roosevelt doesn't become president until March 1st, and Hoover's made almost all the economic decisions to that point, and the fiscal year ends in June of 1933. So when you're looking at the spending, so he raises spending a huge amount, and then he leaves it flat that last year. Okay, so that's one reason you get credit. But in addition to this, he created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And while what they were doing was off budget, and so they are actually making all sorts of loans to businesses and railroads and banks and all sorts of people like that to try to help solve things. So he actually was trying to do quite a bit. And some of the ideas that Roosevelt and the New Deal picked up on were ideas that people bandied about during the Hoover era. But another thing for Hoover is the reason he doesn't get much credit is look at all the pictures you've ever seen of Herbert Hoover, right? All the pictures of it, if you see a smile on his face, it is the barest minimum of a smile that you could possibly see. And there's no twinkle in his eyes or anything along those lines. And he, even though he was known for giving away all sorts of stuff in the early 20s and stuff.
Well, we should, but yeah, we should set some background too. It's like, so Hoover, is like this great guy. Like he's known for like saving all these lives in World War I, right? Like he organizes.
That's right. He was known for like helping developing countries and feeding Western Europe during World War I and doing all sorts of things along those lines. So he was always seen as a big progressive and things. But he believed, but he was a conservative. So, and he believed in voluntarism and stuff, but he actually loaded it up. And another reason he didn't get much credit compared to Roosevelt, just to let this in, is that he was doing it within the existing program. So if you go and read like what was going on in the Department of Agricultural Economics or wherever, they'll be talking about these things and they say, oh yeah, we jacked up all this spending. You go and read what's going on with not the reconstruction. The people are building all the big dams all over the country and stuff. You read what they're saying and say, oh yeah, we're increasing this, road building. We're increasing road building and stuff, but it's all within existing programs. Now think about Hoover and then think about the picture you always have of Franklin Roosevelt. So he's always got his chin, he's looking up in the air. He's got the cigarette sticking out of his mouth or whatever. He's got this big smile. And so, he's just happy as a clam to be helping you out and things. And on top of that, whenever he does something, it's a new program. So it's got, Federal Emergency Relief Administration, Agricultural Adjustment Act, all these various things. And so it's not being hidden the way that Hoover does. And so if you actually look at the deficits that they're running, Hoover's running deficits that are just as big or close to as big as what the deficits are that Roosevelt's running. And during the time frame. And so they're pretty much following pretty much the same policy. Now, the one thing that both of them do is they both keep taxes high. So another reason Hoover doesn't get much credit is that he and the Congress come up with this huge tax increase in 1932, in June of 1932. And so income taxes, if you're in the $1 million tax bracket, you're not very many people, but $1 million tax bracket, your tax rate went from 23 to 58%.
That's the marginal rate?
That's the marginal rate, right? For above $1 million. Now, almost no one's paying income taxes during this period because the minimum income you need to have is really high. It's only about, during the 30s, only about 7% of the population is paying income taxes, but they're paying much higher rates. And the other thing that a lot of people don't realize is, in addition to the income tax rates, they're actually putting new excise taxes on all the new stuff that's going on in the economy. So oil pipeline flows, electricity, bank checks, taxing bank checks. It sounds like the Stamp Act in the American Revolution. Communication, manufacturing of cars and tires and oil and gasoline. So they've just jacked these things up. So they do put all these big income taxes on, and guess what happens to the amount of revenue they collect from income taxes? It sinks like a stone. Right? It just drops like a stone. But they make it all up with all these new excise taxes, and no one really talks about the excise taxes. And so I was stunned when I saw how big the excise tax collections were during this period.
But so the perception, the perception is that Hoover, the stock market crashes and the economy goes into a tailspin that eventually we'll call the Great Depression.
Right.
And the perception is Hoover kind of does nothing. And you're saying he does a lot of stuff. It's just not visible.
Right. Exactly. And so the stuff he does with the federal spending and stuff is not visible. But also they jack the taxes up. And so with every president you want to talk about, it's not just the president. He's president and the Congress and all sorts of things like that. But usually everybody just attaches it to the president these days. Now with the current president, you do have to attach it to the president because he's making all these decisions. He doesn't know what Congress thinks. Matter of fact, he demands them to do what he wants them to do in these kind of cases. But anyway, so now Hoover also, but he was a conservative, right? So he talked about balanced budgets and all sorts of things. And so he did his best to balance the budget. And that's one of the reasons for the tax increases.
That's why he increases the taxes, because he's spending a lot, right?
Yeah, but Roosevelt actually increased taxes. It's just that, the amount the federal government was spending as a share of GDP was much smaller. Like in 1929, they're spending about 3% of GDP on federal spending, right? And so Hoover takes it up to about 5.5 or 6. And then Roosevelt takes it up to about 10% of GDP. Well, going from 2 or 3 to 5.5 or 6, a pretty big jump. But you just don't notice it because he does it within the existing programs. And
So
also, it just has that just kind of
he's too serious. He doesn't do the fireside chats. Is that another thing? He's not sort of creating his own legacy.
Yeah, I don't know, because he was kind of, my understanding is from reading biographies of him is that he was known as being kind of a good communicator in the 20s. And so I don't know what happened, but a lot of times he was asking people to volunteer when he was talking about, he would talk to businesses, right? He was famous for jawboning businesses to keep wages high. And there's another myth that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes that relates to that. So I'll save it for that. But, he just has that stone looking face with the merest hint of a smile if you can get it out of it. But people just don't realize it. And people haven't emphasized it before.
So if you were to criticize Hoover, what exactly did he do wrong? Raise those taxes? Like, should he have just kept the taxes?
Yeah, I think he raised the taxes. That, and the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was a mistake. I don't know if you can blame that on Hoover. I mean, that was mostly Congress and things like that. He maybe, and the other thing, he had a Federal Reserve that really wasn't really paying much attention to what you need to do. They're paying attention to the gold standard more to some extent more than they're paying attention to what's going on internally. And they're not even thinking that they really, they try to lower interest rates, right? They lower the discount rate to a pretty low level, almost to the bottom of where you can lower it, right? But they don't realize that they've got a huge deflation going on. So you've got deflation of 6% per year. So the real interest rate is like 9% or even 11% in 1 year. We've never seen
deflation. Just for people that don't know, this is more broad answer. Deflation is prices are going down. So prices are dropping precipitously. During the Great Depression. Deflation that we haven't seen. I think maybe
we haven't seen it since then. I don't think we maybe had 1 year where we had.
We had 1 year during the financial crisis. I think it was maybe 1 year, maybe slightly negative. Yeah, it's not something we're used to. That price is going down.
Well, and the interesting thing in between 1870 and 1930 or whatever, a lot of times what people used as their symbol of whether or not the economy was in recession is if we had deflation, if prices were dropping. And so, but we had a huge deflation at the beginning of the 30s. So,
and for people that are wondering, okay, why is it bad? Well, prices going down means your wages are going down. And so it's not just like, you don't just go, everything's going down. And this creates a real issue if you're like, owe money. And so if you have a loan and you're earning less money, you still owe $1,000, you still owe $10,000. And so this can be a real burden.
Well, yeah, it creates a nightmare for anybody who's got a loan. And so, but the real interest rate is this really high level that we haven't seen ever, except during this time frame. And the Fed's not even talking about the real interest rate. They're not really talking about the deflation very much. Because you have to remember also, the Fed's a teenager during this period. They created it just started in 1913, right?
I'm not sure the Fed sort of realized what its role was yet. Now we very much look to the Fed as sort of managing they have sort of, they manage monetary policy. And so we sort of look to them when times are bad to, hey, can you do something? Or when we had the recent inflation, hey, can you do something about this Fed? I mean, they probably didn't even think that was necessarily, they had this bigger role back then. Do they even think of themselves like that?
Yeah. I mean, if you read, Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz's Monetary History of the United States, and then you read Alan Meltzer's History of the Fed, they talk a lot about what the various ideas people had and things like that. And they were conflicting during this period. The regional Feds played a bigger role in the Atlanta Fed was actually known for being more like, let's lend a bunch of money or provide a lot of backing for loans so that you can get through a liquidity crisis. But the other groups or whatever were less influenced by that. So there's a huge literature about the role played by monetary policy. And people have been fighting about that ever since Friedman and Schwartz came out with the Monetary History of the United States, probably even earlier than that. So I think that if I were to say, even the people who don't believe that monetary policy was that important, they would think that it's probably about 30% of the reason why the Depression occurred. There's another 70 out there. But other people who are monetarists, like Mike Bordeaux, for example, would probably give it a much bigger role. So that's always the problem with the Depression. There's so many stupid things and bad things happening that it's like, what do you do? I mean, how do you pick which bad thing is going on that you're going to focus on?
All right. So myth one, we have Hoover. Hoover's unfairly maligned. Hoover does stuff. Maybe he doesn't do the right stuff, but he's doing things. He's trying things. What's myth two?
Okay. So myth two, this is the one I most commonly talk about when I do it, because this showed up all the time in like the World Book Encyclopedia. I gave talks in Korea, and the people that, so this stuff's in their high school textbooks and things like that. And that is that when Roosevelt came in and started spending the money on the New Deal, that he was following the ideas of John Maynard Keynes, who is one of the greatest economists of all time. Even if you don't like what Keynes said, I mean, you have to agree that he was one of the greatest economists of all time, one of the most influential.
Yeah,
renowned. So what was a Keynes policy? So we've got this problem. We've got 30 or 25% unemployment in 1933 when Roosevelt comes in. Real GDP is 30% lower than what it was in 1929. So if you want just a visual for that, just cut off every state west of the Mississippi River. And
it's as if we lost that.
That's what we lost. We lost the production of half the country.
And just to also put in perspective, 25% unemployment. The unemployment rate right now is what, 4%? So
yeah, 4. Somewhere in that neighborhood. And when you talk about the Great Recession, I had someone tell me the Great Recession was probably worse than the Great Depression. I spent a lot of time on the airplane disabusing them of that notion. I think the Great Recession, the highest unemployment rate was about 10% or 11%. And that lasted for a month. Whereas with during the Great Depression, the unemployment rate went to 9 during 1930, then went to 15 during 1930, 31, then went to over 20 for the next 4 years. Over 20%, and then it finally drops down below, and then it goes back up to 19% in 1937, 38, and then finally it drops down to about 9 in 1939. Whole decade of just insane unemployment.
Yeah, just a whole decade of like a terrible economy that I don't think we've seen. You know, the Great Recession is the closest thing we had, and that was, you know, didn't last anywhere near.
Well, I'll talk about that in a minute too. But the great thing about the Great Recession, you had a decline in output of 4%. So that's not very big, and that was like 2 states. Get rid of 2 states that you don't like, and that's the Great Recession.
So FDR comes in,
and so FDR comes in, and he starts spending a lot more money. All right, and so John Maynard Keynes is in the middle of writing his general theory. Okay, it was a very famous book, came out in 1935. He's giving discussions and seminars and things around the world about the general theory, and the basic idea is that you can end up in an equilibrium below full employment, and you can't get out of it because of things that, structural things that block you from getting out of that equilibrium. So you're going to be in a bad position. So one way to do this is to stimulate the economy, and what you have the government do is raise spending and or lower taxes and run fiscal deficits. Okay. And so Roosevelt, actually Hoover had been too, were raising spending, but they were not lowering taxes. Okay. And so the deficits were pretty small.
And just the idea that the Keynes idea would be like, basically he has this idea of animal spirits where people are kind of scared, so they're overly saving. We have some assets that are not being productive. And so the government can sort of step in, fill that void, get people moving again, put these assets back into production, and sort of kickstart the economy.
Right. And so the government can help stimulate it by doing certain things like spending a lot of money and reducing taxes. Okay, but that's not what they've been doing. What actually Keynes actually comes out, he actually writes an open letter to the president, and it shows up in the New York Times, shows up in the Los Angeles Times in late 1933. And he says, look, this is good. You're spending more money, but you're not running deficits. Deficits aren't big enough. You need to lower taxes too. And remember, the taxes have just jacked up really high. And so, and actually Roosevelt actually met with Keynes at one point. And Roosevelt just kind of considered him to be more like a math jock or whatever, and didn't really pay too much attention to him. Now, he did have people among his economic advisors and stuff who kind of thought about running deficits and stuff, but not the way that Keynes did. But the problem was huge, right? So you're 30% below where you were in 1929, and he's running a deficit that's 4% or 5% of GDP. Well, that's not going to do anything. That's not going to save the problem. And so, but because everybody sees the spending, this myth develops where everybody just says, oh, Roosevelt spent more money. Oh, there we go. That's an example of Keynesian spending because Keynes was around and he was writing the general theory during this period. Except that all sorts of Keynesians since that time have studied the issue. So Alva Hansen in the 40s, he was kind of the leading Keynesian guy in the 40s. He says, no, he never even tried it. They're running these tiny deficits relative to the size of the problem. So that's him in the 1940s, right? Everybody ignores him, I guess. And so then you got E. Cary Brown in the 1950s comes out, writes this influential article in the Journal of Economic History. Economic historians understand this. Nope, didn't run a Keynesian policy. Deficit's too small relative to the size of the problem. No one seems to pay attention to E. Cary Brown except their economic historians. And then Larry Peppers writes another paper in Explorations in Economic History in 1976 or whatever, says exactly the same thing E. Cary Brown does, just in a more sophisticated way. But still, World Book Encyclopedia and everybody else just repeats the myth.
Well,
And
still
so-
to this day, but I would say this myth is not. Myth is not gone. Everyone thinks everyone
makes
thinks
me
the New
kind of
Deal.
feel bad. I've been teaching economic history and doing these things for a very long time, and they don't listen to me. And but basically, it's definitely true. They just did not run a Keynesian policy during the 1930s. The deficits were too small. It wasn't what John Maynard Keynes said we should have done. Okay, but the myth is still there. I'm sure. I actually rewrote the article for the for the World Book Encyclopedia about the economics article. And so the reason I did that was I was writing all these, arcane journal articles, stuff that my nieces and my family couldn't read. I thought, well, I'll rewrite it. They asked me to rewrite the article, so I did. Then what they decided to do, they didn't like my rewrite very much, so they just changed a few things. And I said, well, take my name off of it. So they let me go, put me in there and stuff. And so, but I didn't get to talk about this issue and that part. I have other issues I talked about. But anyway, I wanted at least someone that I knew could understand what was written by having a World Book article.
All right. So he basically didn't spend, for it to be like a typical Keynesian stimulus, he would have had to have lower taxes. And so they still weren't running with deficits.
He needed much bigger deficits than what he.
Okay. So you want to move to the next myth then?
Yeah. So I don't know if we want, this one's more arcane in a sense. This is more in the macroeconomics literature in the last 20 years, probably including some of your professors. When you were
I saw your notes. I believe Ohanian's on there. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And Lee's a great guy. He's a really good economist and things like that. And so so one thing that happened is that there have been these different kinds of macroeconomics that have developed in the last 40 years or so. So there's a group of kind of rational expectations, active expectations group, and things like this. And then there's another group that really focuses on the blockages and how the system works and things along those lines. Okay, and so Lee Ohanian and Hal Cole, Lee was one of your professors at UCLA and Hal Cole was at Penn. They wrote an article using kind of a microeconomic, the standard kind of dynamic macro model. And what they did was they said, well, look, the National Recovery Administration, which was this agency that developed in the 30s, it was kind of a weird agency or whatever. So the idea behind the National Recovery Administration is there's all this really intense competition that's going on. All the businesses are just saying, we're just getting killed because prices are dropping and there are just too many people out there producing. So we need to find a way to control this. And this is what businesses always want to do. They want to control competition if they can and things like that. Yeah, but
so people always get this wrong. Businesses hate a free market. They hate a competitive market. They want want to own the market.
They want to make money.
Yeah.
Okay. They want to make money. And so the good thing is a free market allows them to make money, but also limits how much they can make at the same time. So anyway, at the same time, labor markets are not doing very well. Wages are dropping, and actually our weekly hours are dropping. Employment's dropping, so everything's bad for workers as well. And so they come up with this idea of having the National Recovery Administration. And so the idea was to bring together people, the consumers and employers and the workers together, and have them meet and decide, well, what are going to be the rules of the game in each industry that you're talking about? Okay, so you've got these people, and so it turns out pretty much the consumers don't get to play very much of a role in this. And so it's pretty much between the workers and the employers have a lot more power at this time than the workers do. So one of the things that the employers do is that they basically eliminate antitrust laws, and so they act like a cartel. I mean, they actually raise prices, and they try to limit output and make more money that way. Okay, and so they have these limits that they're imposing, and the government's gonna regulate it and help them do it. So it's almost like a government-sponsored cartel.
Right, basically, yeah, and it's a way for them to raise prices.
Right, and make more money. Because for them to raise prices, they have to limit output too. Now, on the workers' side, the workers are in a position where they're in really bad shape. I mean, they're worried about their wages falling, and actually one of the worst things that keeps happening to them is that they keep seeing their weekly hours drop. So the hourly earnings might stay the same, but weekly hours in 1929 averaged about 48 weekly hours per week of work. Okay. And then by the middle of 1932, you're down to 32 hours a week. And if your hourly wage hasn't changed, just think what your weekly wage looks like when you've just eliminated a third of all the stuff that you're doing.
And so I think, people don't understand this. They see the unemployment and you see the unemployment rate, but a lot of there was underemployment. And
on top of the 30% or 25% unemployment, everybody's working a lot less.
Yeah. And it's my understanding is basically the employers would go to the worker and say, look, we could lay off some of you, or we could just lower everybody's hours. And oftentimes they would opt for everyone to just lower the hours.
That's basically, so when the macro modelers are looking at these kind of things, what they're seeing is that Hoover's jawboning for them to keep hourly earnings the same. The National Recovery Administration's trying to get them to keep hourly earnings the same. But that's what they focus on. They don't focus on the other pieces. And the other pieces of the story is that they're actually trying to do almost a job sharing arrangement, which is something that we usually associate with the French. and so this is the version. We're actually acting like French economists now, because they were actually trying to limit weekly hours. So they actually shot to cut weekly hours from about 48 down to about 35 to try to increase employment. And so I've just got a paper that just came out or is coming out in the American Economic Journal for Macroeconomics. So that's with Nick Zebarth and Chris Vickers. And so we go through and we document how they're doing this. And so they really do. They want to keep wages up, but they also want to keep people employed. And so they cut hours. And if you don't pay enough attention to what's going on with the hours, then you're going to model this thing and you're going to miss a lot of what's happening. Because if all you do is focus on high wages and high wage policy, you're missing the other constraints, which is going to screw your model up. Okay. So
I would just say, sorry, this is a personal story. This is interesting too, because this was my great grandfather's experience. He worked the oil fields here in Southern California, and he didn't get laid off, but he had his hours cut, way down. And so it was like, oh, it was hard. And I was, and I remember my grandma saying, oh, it's hard. He didn't lose his job, but he was only working like half the week.
Yeah, exactly. And so, that's the way they were trying to solve the problem. Hoover's trying to do that. Before they could really get the NRA off the ground, they developed a president's reemployment agreement. And remember, look at the emphasis, president's reemployment agreement, which is big part of it was cutting hours down and then putting more people to work. So we got less hours. And so the macro guys are modeling these things, and Hal Cole and Leo Hanian have a microeconomic model. And they say, look, normally, if you have a deep recession like what happened with the Great Depression, you get a very rapid recovery. So their counterfactual world without the National Recovery Administration is a very rapid recovery.
And we should say, if you look back in U.S. history before this, the U.S. has several downturns, and generally the economy recovers pretty rapidly. Is that correct?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, in most time periods, that's true. The other time where you don't see a really rapid recovery is after the Great Recession. Okay. And there are all sorts of things that you could have related to that.
But like we have, there's the panic of like 1893, there's one in 1907, and like the economy.
They speed up, they come back pretty quickly.
Right. And so the what's weird about the Great Depression is that it goes down and it stays down for so long. And so so Cole and Ohanian, are they blaming this sort of cartel?
Blaming the national. So basically what happens is they're expecting recovery to be relatively quick. And so you could almost be back to 1939 levels by 1935. Okay. And then the truth is that they're still pretty substantially below the 1929 level in 1935. Okay. And so Lee and Hal developed this model, this dynamic model that they try to relate to what's going on. And so what they find is if they put the NRA into their model, the NRA is between the actual, it's higher than the actual. Okay, but it's lower than what they're expecting, the rapid recovery. And so they claim that the NRA accounts for more than half of the slow recovery. Okay, so they're saying that the economy recovered much more slowly because of the National Recovery Administration than it should have. Okay, so that's what their claim is with this model. Now, then there's on the other side, there's Gauti Egerton, who's at the New York Fed. Okay, and Gauti, another guy doing dynamic models and things like this. And he's looking at things, a lot of people don't realize this, but there's all this big claims about you can't lower interest rates below zero. And once you're in that, you're in kind of a weird world. So he develops a model with this weird world with you can't, the interest rates are just way down low and you can't go anywhere. His counterfactual is that if you had not had the National Recovery Administration, the economy would have gone from 30% below 1929 in 1933 to 50% below 1929 in 1935. Okay, so this is the other story.
So the macroeconomists are fighting, basically.
They're fighting.
So you
Yeah.
So Colin Ohanian are saying this thing is bad. You have this other person whose name is escaping me. Is
okay.
Gauti Egerson.
And he's a smart guy too. So these are really, really smart people and really good, really good at what they do. But the models are just drastically different. And so what Gauti finds when you use his model, when you put the National Recovery Administration in, what happens is it improves things quite a bit and it gets you much closer to the actual. So he says that the National Recovery Administration accounts for more than half of the faster recovery as a result of the Great Depression, because you don't go nearly down as far as you should have. So it's kind of interesting seeing this modeling situation. This is kind of like inside baseball to some extent to most people, but you can get into these.
The layperson is going to come away from this thinking, oh, I should never trust a macroeconomist, basically.
Yeah, and that's too bad, because actually, in most cases, everybody's got this figured out. Well, not completely. We do know that tariffs are not a good idea, but
okay, all right. we had the smooth holiday too. But what's the myth here? I mean, is the myth that people just don't understand?
So the myth is that all they were doing was keeping wages high, but in fact, they were keeping wages high and they were also cutting hours sharply. And one of the biggest things that happens as a result of all this is, if you look, ever since that time, the hours were like in the high 40s during the 1920s. Okay, so they were working 48, 49, 50 hours a week, in some industries even more. Okay, and then it drops down to 32 or so, goes back up really quickly for a short period of time. And then when the National Recovery Administration comes in and the President's Reemployment Agreement, they cut these hours sharply again. And they never go over 40 hours a week again, ever, except maybe 1 year. And so what you're seeing is this now, whether it's the cause was the Depression or was the policy, because the Supreme Court shut the National Recovery Administration down as being unconstitutional in the middle of 1935. So to me, actually, if you think about the combination of running a cartel, high prices, low output, and things like this, and then, this kind of mishmash thing going on in the labor market, to me, the Supreme Court in 1935 is like the heroes of the American economy, because they saved us from this just total insanity that we were running. We're running the exact reverse of every antitrust policy we've ever come up with.
Right. Yeah. Basically, it's like turning over, every industry to whatever, the biggest corporations.
Right. To the big corporations. And at the same time, they're running this insane French version of the world where they're cutting hours to maintain employment and doing all sorts of stuff. So part of the reason for the slow recovery is you have all this uncertainty about what's going on. So uncertainty is a death knell for an economy, wherever. And so that's one of the worries about the tariff policies currently, is we have no idea what they are. And so no one can make any plans. And so same kind of things going on in the 1930s as well.
Yeah. So if you read like contemporary accounts from that time period, this is what the people in business kept complaining about, is they just have no idea what the policies are going to be. And so there's like this stereotype, there's like a British stereotype of like the jittery American businessman, because they don't know, like they don't know what the next, government program is going to be, thing is going to happen, next policy is going to be. And so they just can't plan. And this is death to economy. And that's what you're drawing the parallel to today, where it's like, if I can't plan out the future, I can't make sort of long-term investment decisions. Like, this is ultimately going to kill growth.
Right. Exactly. So we really don't, so it's kind of messy, all these kind of things. And so anytime you have uncertainty, that's just really not good for the economy. You really want to have, that's why, all these studies by, people who study long-run economic growth around the world and things like this, and say one of the reasons that they cite as being a really good, important feature of the economy is you want it to have a stable set of rules. You want the rule of law.
Rule of law.
Even-handed up front, beforehand. You want to say that beforehand, because if you lose the case, you're always unhappy about whether it was even or not. But you want it to, rule of law, even-handed, and things like this. And the successful economies, the one that became rich, are ones where they do have this stability. And another feature of them too is they develop rules that are rules where anybody can, if they follow the rule, they can just start
Exactly.
a process. So
Yeah.
you don't want to be in a situation where it's who you are determines what your role in the economy is going to be.
Yeah.
You
And
don't want to be in
so,
kind of an anonymous situation or where everybody's got an opportunity.
right. There's this great, yeah. So it's like equality of opportunity. The laws are equally applied. There's this great podcast with DeSoto, who wrote this book on Peru,
Oh, yeah.
where he hires a grad student. So he hires a grad student to get like a business license, and it takes the grad student like 287 days or something.
Actually,
working,
I think it was as many as 500.
might have been, it was some super long amount, right? And this is the grad students working like 8 hours a day, right? And like I think DeSoto is he's like talking to the finance minister, and the finance minister is like, why don't you just ask me? I could get it to you in a week. And this is like exactly what you don't want.
Exactly.
Like this is
Exactly
you don't want it to be one set of rules for one type of people, and then another set of rules like, if I know somebody, I can get it done. And this, by the way, this is my experience when I moved to Spain to teach in Spain, where my visa wasn't getting done. My Spanish visa was not getting done. Like it was like I just kept calling the embassy, it wasn't getting done. And then finally, I just emailed the like president of the university and said, "Hey, sorry, I'm not going to be able to get there because the visa's not done." And then magically, the next day, it was done.
Exactly. That's exactly
So,
why. Well, I remember
all right,
that DeSoto book because he had like a diagram where we showed you all the going forward and then back and forth and all sorts of stuff. So,
yeah, I forget the name of it. It's like the elusive quest for growth, I want to say, or something like that.
Let's see. No, it's I got
It's
it on
maybe-
my bookshelf. I just looked at it. Oh, I can't find it. Oh, well. Well, and DeSoto is a descendant of Juan DeSoto, the Spaniard guy who came over and claimed all this land for these things.
All right, I forget what myth we're on. So
we just finished the myth about high wages.
High wages. Okay.
So here's a big question. And this actually relates to what we were talking about with the macroeconomy. So was the recovery slow or fast? I mean, that's a big question we have. So this is kind of a myth. They're myths on all sides. So depending on who you are with respect to the New Deal, you've got a whole set of myths that you follow if you love the New Deal, and you have a whole set of myths that you follow if you hated the New Deal. Okay. And
yes. So I guess, does this relate to what ultimately ended the Great Depression as well? I'm not sure.
Yeah, to some extent. Right. So, here's one thing to think. I mean, people sometimes think the New Deal was some well thought out policy that they put in place. But in fact, it was a mishmash of policies. They have so many problems going on. You've got high unemployment, farm prices are way down.
You got bank panics going on.
Just everything you can think.
You have environmental disasters. You have the Dust Bowl.
The Dust Bowl and things along those lines. You've got floods, huge floods. People don't pay as much attention to floods during this period. It's like the trials of Job throughout the 1930s. Smoot-Hawley's screwing up the world economy.
Oh, right. Yeah. You have the tariffs.
You got high tax rates. You got all these things. And so the New Deal is really like, okay, God, we got 50 problems. Let's try to come up with a solution for each one. Okay. And so if you try to come up with a solution for each one, you're bound to not be consistent. So if you think about this, so they're worried about low farm prices and farms just falling apart. And then, farms are already having trouble in the 20s because World War I was this big boom because we're feeding all of Europe and the rest of the world. And then it falls off. And so farms are failing in the 20s and stuff. And then farm prices just drop like a stone in the 30s. And so things are looking bad. So how do you try to stop this? Well, you develop the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. And their goal was to pay farmers to take land out of production so that they can reduce the supply and raise farm prices. Okay. That's good for the farmers and things like this. Now, but there's also this problem of 30% unemployment. Well, guess what happens to the farm unemployment when you have the Agricultural Adjustment Act and you've just cut the amount of acreage around that time? Well,
so what is their idea exactly? So they're trying to take land out of production, and the idea then is to raise prices.
So their goal is to restrict supply, and the way that they're going to do it is they're going to take land out of production.
Okay.
And by taking land out of production, and then what happens is
you're going to increase. Yeah, then you're going to increase and then unemployment will rise.
But the problem is that also increases unemployment at a time when you already have high unemployment. And the other thing is high food prices, and you've already got high unemployment. So that's a problem for all the people who are trying to eat when they don't have any money because they're unemployed and things like this. And then you've got the National Recovery Administration letting people raise prices and limit output. And, you just got all sorts of funky stuff that's going on and not,
Yeah, and so
it's
then
bad
the New
news.
Deal is not really a cohesive plan. It's just they're just basically, hey, we're going to try this program here. We're going to try this program here. We're going to do like a works program with WPA. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, like, for the last 27 years with Sean and a whole bunch of other co-authors, but Sean deserves a lot of credit in this because he found the original data, and we've been working together for quite some time. And also the other co-authors do too. It's just that there's such a long list that I can't emphasize all of them. But but when it turns out that we have like a laundry list of things that we've studied where we think, this policy worked and this policy did not. And so that's what I summarized in that Journal of Economic Literature paper, and that we need to put together in the book and make it more readable than reading a bunch of econometric.
Well, I have the YouTube brain since we started this YouTube channel. What you need to do, Price, is to do a tier list. Like you have each New Deal agency, and you like A tier, B tier, C tier, F tier.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay.
Like kind of
that.
like a yeah.
I like
you
that.
need to rank them because it's a mixed bag, right? Like some policies help and some policies hurt.
Right. And so here's some examples. Okay. So public works and relief. So the relief programs is like the first major one was the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. That starts in 1933. And it is a mixture. They actually both hand out money with no strings attached to it to the poor. And then they also have work relief programs as well. Okay, attached to that to some extent is the Civil Works Administration, which lasted only about 4 months. Okay, and then they're not fully satisfied with what's going on with the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which we call the FERA, in the middle of 1935. And so Congress and the president and everybody renegotiates. And so what they do is they go to the Works Progress Administration, which is the federal government gets control of work relief for able-bodied people. And then they return the responsibility for people who can't work for relief with no strings attached to the state and local governments. Okay. So those things. And so typically what happens under the WPA under work relief is you would work a certain number of hours per week and things, and they would pay you about half to 2/3 of a normal wage. Okay. And then you would do work, and then they limit how much you want to work because they've got a limited amount of budget. So they're trying to help a lot of people. Okay. So in a lot of ways, it's kind of like the equivalent of unemployment insurance today, except
right.
you're not getting,
you're not getting your full amount. You're getting the partial amount.
You're getting a partial amount. But,
okay.
And then now at the same time, they also have public works programs, and the public works programs are much bigger. They tend to be things like Hoover Dam, which started before the New Deal, but actually a lot of it was financed by that. And they're building like giant sewers and water treatment plants and big roads and all sorts of things like that. Now, they actually run that like a normal government activity. So the normal government activity there, you hire a firm, and they go out and they contract with a whole bunch of people, and they hire workers, and they pay them the regular wage. And okay. So the combination of those two, it's kind of hard to separate them out because they tend to be in the same spots. So we did some studies, and what we found is that the public works and relief, they have these stories about multipliers, right? So you have a multiplier, you come in, you spend the money, say you spend $100 million in this one spot. Well, how much do you get? How much does the growth occur in that spot? If the multiplier is 1, you get $100 million, okay, is what happens to economic income. If the multiplier is 2, you're going to get the $100 million that you spent, plus you're going to get all this spillover stuff going on with everybody producing all sorts of stuff in the background. And so then you get $200 million now. And so that's what people hope is going to happen. And then
can you give us the background of why we would expect there to be a multiplier? Like what is the theory for?
Well, that's what people have suggested. So the idea is that I go out, I spend all this money. The workers that I hired then go out, and what they do is they get haircuts, and they buy food, and they buy a house and do all these other kind of things. And so this spills over into other parts of the economy. Okay. And so you get this effect. So this is like a Keynesian story that they always taught in the 1970s. I don't think they taught this to you at UCLA in graduate school, I have to admit.
So in macro, yeah, I don't know.
Probably not. I don't. So, but this is what I was taught in the 70s when I was in school and things.
No, so but this is like sort of standard fiscal policy.
Yeah, this is pretty standard fiscal stuff.
That you would teach.
There was a big discussion of multipliers when they had the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009. So Valerie Ramey at University of California, San Diego did all these surveys of everybody, what they found and stuff. Now, but it also could be the case that you're spending money in this area, but you're crowding out other economic activity at the same time. And so you could also get a situation where you only get $50 million. And so what happens is the multiplier is 0.5, which is not good news. And so in that case, whatever, you've crowded out a whole bunch of activity. And that kind of thing happens.
Can you walk through the logic of that? Why would it be?
So
why
the best
I spend $100 million? Why would I somehow get less?
Well, the best example of that would be, just to give you an example, is World War II. Okay, so what do? We go out and we spend $100 million in LA on aircraft production for the military. Okay, but that's not stuff we normally produce. And so what happened is, to produce all those aircraft, we had to start producing cars and tires and
we're not as good at producing the aircraft as we are as the cars. And so
that's right. And so what happens?
So we're less efficient.
Crowding out regular economic
more efficient economic activity with less efficient economic activity.
Well, in that case, however, World War II, we're trying to fight this huge war, right?
Well, yeah.
And so, but the way we fight it is we sacrifice normal economic activity. You can't buy appliances, and you can't buy automobiles, you can't buy new tires, things like that. So that's a crowding out scenario.
Okay, so back to the programs. So we have these.
So what we found with the public works and relief is that the multiplier was about 1. Okay, and so what happens is that you spend the money and it goes out to the people and stuff, but you don't get a big spillover effect. And so that's one thing. Now, if an example of crowding out is the AAA program, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration program I told you about, that actually has a natural crowd out put into it already.
Right. It's sort of goal.
You're paying these guys to take land out of production.
Right.
And so if you look at the areas where they spend more on the AAA and stuff like that, the GDP actually go in that area, the income in that area actually goes down a little bit. So not only do you have it's not just a zero multiplier, it's actually a negative multiplier, which is not really good news. I'm not a big fan of the AAA, I got to tell you.
So, well, as I'm saying, you put it on the tier list, you give it the F tier.
Exactly.
It goes in,
getting an F,
it goes in the bottom tier.
Things like that. Well, the other thing about it is we're still got all these farm programs. We cannot kill the farm programs.
You can't kill the you can't kill the farm.
They're like vampires. They're out there.
But if you go around the world, no country can kill their farm programs.
No,
every country has some form of agricultural subsidy, right? And so
exactly. Farmers account for 2% of the population, but they are really powerful in the legislature.
They are super powerful. When I lived in Japan in a agricultural village, and like my friends were all farmers there, and they never worked. They they play video games like all day, and I'm like, how do you guys never work? And they're like, oh, the government gives us all this money because we're farmers and we don't need to do that. It's like, most of this is mechanized. Like most of farming was mechanized by that
That's
point.
right. Well, if you think about it, who are these guys that are collecting these checks to stop payment? Well, it's Ted Turner and Scottie Pippen and all these guys who own all this land that gets AAA payments. So I hope
these days
Scotty and Ted don't pay much attention to this.
No, but actually, it's funny. And if you go to the EU, I believe the Queen of England got some like EU subsidies for a long time as well.
Oh, I'm sure. France,
since she was a farmer technically, or there was
the
farming going on.
1920s and 1930s are infamous. I was involved in this project where a bunch of guys wrote about each of the countries, and every country was doing all this kind of stuff. And so they would buy up the excess production, and then they always talk about one of the Nordic countries, wherever, has like a butter mountain that's composed of all the butter that they bought during the 1930s to maintain butter prices in the situation. So
okay, so we have the public work programs sort of they're like even. The AAA is negative, and so you're saying
now be careful about saying even. They're actually productive because they're actually giving you that a multiplier of 1 is still good.
Oh, right. Okay. So you got a multiplier 1.
So that's still good. Now, the other thing is the relief programs turn out to have very positive effects on death rates in cities and things like this. We did another study where we were looking at this, and what we found is that you spend like a couple of $1 million in modern dollars on relief, on relief for the poor and things like that in these cities. And you actually reduce suicides by 1 suicide, and you reduce like about 3 disease deaths and even 1 homicide during this period. So for like a relatively small amount of money, you save about 5 lives, at least in correlations. It's not, we think we've got causation there too, but we're not absolutely sure.
So what you're saying is the New Deal is really it's a mixed bag. So you have some programs that
the programs that are the best, I think, are the Public Works and Relief. The Homeowners Loan Corporation was a pretty successful program too.
And just for listeners who don't know, that one is guaranteeing mortgages, right?
No, well, it's actually not guaranteeing mortgages. Okay, so let me describe what they do.
It's buying up mortgages, right?
It's buying mortgages. So they had this huge problem where all sorts of people, like we were talking earlier about the deflation during this period. And suddenly, when you have deflation and the price levels dropping like this, the money that you're paying back on a loan goes up in value a great deal. So you may have borrowed money that was worth $1 before, but now it's worth $1.20 when you pay it back.
Right, because you're making less.
So a lot of people were in deep trouble with this, and plus you got people unemployed, can't pay their mortgage.
Plus,
so
it's my
Go ahead.
Yeah, and it's also my understanding that the mortgages aren't like today, where you have like a monthly payment or something like that. Like often they come due all at once.
Well, so what you typically did, so a standard mortgage for insurance companies and some banks, not very many banks, was you paid the interest on the mortgage every month, and then at the end of the period, you paid back the principal. So the amount that you borrowed.
You'd have this like bullet payment, I think it was called, right? Right.
Now, there's the building and loans during this time period. We've done a bunch of studies of building and loans, or kind of like cooperative agreements or whatever. And so the building and loans had a structure where what you did was you actually, while you're paying the interest, you actually bought shares in the building and loan. And so it was pretty much acted like a mortgage where you're paying back the principal at the same time.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
And so there are a lot of people who have building and loan mortgages during this time frame. But
so
you've got 30% unemployment or 25%
yeah.
unemployment.
Yeah, I guess you can't really pay it regardless. However it's structured, it's going to be hard to pay.
And so what the Homeowners Loan Corporation came in and did was that it bought 1 million mortgages. And what they did was they bought it at, kind of the prices that are during a regular time period. And they bought them from the lender, and then they turned around, and their Homeowners Loan Corporation is a corporation, government-sponsored corporation. And then they refinanced the mortgages for the people who had been borrowing. And they lowered their interest rate down to 5% and then eventually to 4.5%. And then they gave them like a 15-year loan. So they extended the period of the loan. And they set it up so that they paid an even amount all the way across. So it looks a lot like the standard mortgage you see today. Okay.
And 1 million, I would imagine 1 million is a significant amount. I mean, can we put a percentage on that?
If you're talking about 1 million loans, you're talking about, at the time, probably about 20% of all non-farm loans.
So that's huge. So basically the government, so if you think about, you could almost think about it in terms of like, the recent Great Recession. Like this was basically a bailout to homeowners, like homeowners.
And so if you think about this, now most of the people who talk about it often emphasize the refinancing, because the refinancing is really a good deal. Because these people, basically, they were picking mortgages where they were trying to pick mortgages where the people were unemployed and got into trouble not because they were playing games, but because they just got in really bad shape.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. And so, but they thought that they would repay. And so that's what they're shooting for. And so the goal was to keep the people in their homes. Right. So that's really important. The other side of it too was they bought the mortgages from the lender so that they're replacing these really bad loans on the lender's books. So they're also trying to recharge the lending facilities for the economy as well. Okay. So that was the goal. And so they did this over a 3-year period from 1933, the end of 33. They're pretty much done by the end of 35. They're cleaning everything up in the first 6 months of 36. So anyways, they turn out to be, the benefit from this program is they can't reverse things with the mortgage, because what happens in the early 30s is housing prices drop a lot in nominal terms. If you adjust for inflation, they don't drop nearly so much. They maybe drop 10% or something like that. But they have all these foreclosures, right? And so what they do is the home ownership rate drops a lot. So what they're able to do is stop the drop in the home ownership rate and stop the drop in housing prices. Okay. And so as a result, then they don't reverse things, but then they stop it in place. And it turns out that they don't lose that much money in the process of doing it. Matter of fact, there's some people who tell a story that they made money. That's not true. That pops up all the time. We actually looked at the data when the HOLC finished in 1951. And actually, they finished. They're one of the few federal government programs that no longer exist after they started. Okay. And when they finished, we looked at the books and they lost about 2.5% on the loans, somewhere in that neighborhood. Now, up front, before, they thought they could lose as much as 30 or 40% on the loans.
Right.
Now, the idea that people thought that they made money on the loans was this story that people were telling where they said, oh, yeah, they made money on the loans. And we traced back the citations to this. And we found the main citation was a citation to an article in Time magazine in like 1946 or 45, something like this, that was saying that the HOLC was in good shape, but they didn't say anything about profits. And so when we actually looked at it, so they lost some money, but not very much. And at the same time, they kept a huge number of people in their houses and put them in a much better position to be able to do things in their situation.
Well,
and
it's just a massive
very
program.
helpful to black lenders. So for black lenders in this time frame, the HOLC, black lenders probably had more problems than white lenders did because they just have lower incomes and more likely to become unemployed. But by the end of when you look at what the
lenders or borrowers? Do you mean borrowers or
borrowers? Black borrowers.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. They were very good for black borrowers. So I may have screwed that up with lenders.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay. So they end up when you look at the stock of loans they have, about 4.5% of the loans that they hold are for black borrowers. If you look at the stock of loans being held by all other lenders, it's like 2.5% are black loans. So the HOLC is actually doing a lot to maintain and keep blacks in their homes and not losing the homes in this kind of period. And so they were actually good and the other thing about it is that unlike other people, they were charging blacks the same interest rate as whites, and they were providing the same loan terms for whites and blacks that they were before. That's not true for other lenders at the time. To my mind, or whatever, if you actually go back and look at the history of the treatment of blacks by government, if you look at state, local, federal, they almost all routinely treat blacks badly until you get into the 1930s. And the HOLC is one of the first agencies that actually treat them in a reasonable way.
Right.
And so
the HOLC is like on our tier list. It's like it's
I have
really
it very high. Now, unfortunately, after they finished making all the loans, or pretty much after they making all the loans, they went out and they did all these studies of cities around the United States. And in each of these cities, they looked at all the neighborhoods, and then they drew these maps where they had these areas the areas where you wouldn't generally provide mortgages were marked in red. And so you've heard the term redlining.
Yeah, this is where redlining comes from.
That's one of the possibilities. It turns out that the FHA also drew red lines on maps and stuff.
Okay. So we have two different potential
So we got two different agencies. But the HOLC drew these maps, and they're detailed maps, and they also did detailed analysis of each of the neighborhoods and stuff. And so those maps have become available and online at Richmond. I think it's University of Richmond or the Richmond Fed, one of those two places. So a lot of people have been doing a lot of modern studies about segregation. And a lot of them have been blaming the HOLC as a primary cause of segregation because they created these maps. Now, the problem with that story is that the HOLC was pretty much done with their program at the time they created the maps.
And you're saying they also treated black borrowers very fairly in terms of giving them the same rate,
and much more fairly than almost any other.
And they had a higher percentage of in their portfolio. There was a higher percentage of black mortgages. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And so the other thing was that you can actually see in their discussions and stuff, and a number of people have written about this, that they decided that they want to keep those maps out of the hands of the general public. They just keep them within their own thing. And they actually literally know how many maps they have. And they actually, in the National Archives, they can tell you who was holding on, which agency was holding on to the maps at the time, and what ultimately happens. But they're very careful. They don't want to show these maps to people because they're worried that people are going to misuse the maps. Now, I don't know whether they're worried about misusing it for race reasons or for a variety of other reasons and things like this. But there's been that kind of this literature where a lot of people have said, oh, the HOLC created these maps and they're the driving force behind segregation that's followed since that time. So that is a myth, and that's a bad one because if you
Because you're saying this program we should celebrate this program because it helped people stay in homes. Generally, it seemed like it treated people fairly, and you applied to like 20% of the population or something. So
right, and what they're doing is they actually keep these maps. People know about the maps. They talk about the methods that they use, but they really don't show them to anybody. Even they don't even show them to the guys who helped them create it. Because what they did was they went to real estate professionals in each city. They picked out like 5 or 10 and said, here's what we think's going on with the neighborhoods. Do you agree? Look at this, help us figure out what to do here. And then they wouldn't give them copies of the map. So I think that's a good sign. But the other thing about it is if you actually look at segregation patterns at that time, the US became much more segregated over time between 1900 and 1930. And if you look at the levels of segregation between 1930 and 1940, they're pretty similar. And so the 1930s before the HOLC, 1940s after. We know for 3 cities, we know the timing of when the maps come into when they come into existence. And you can see that there's no change in the timing or what they're doing in between before and after the maps. And so the HOLC, the fact that they were segregation oriented, almost everybody was like a segregationist at that point. But the things that were driving the segregation were all sorts of different issues, right? They had zoning laws, and if you read the history of those zoning laws and what people were saying in the 20s when they introduced zoning, a lot of them were using the zoning for segregation methods. You had all those covenants and all those.
Yeah, you had
mortgages.
literal racial covenants at this time period where if you sold a house, often written into the loan was that you weren't allowed to sell it to a different race, right? Is that?
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly. And so plus, blacks have a lot less income. The housing areas have lower housing prices, which are affordable. Blacks are getting screwed by the educational system, the segregated schools that are unequal. There are all sorts of things that are causing problems for them. So to put all this emphasis on the HOLC is a mistake. Now, what the HOLC maps do tell you is people's view of the world at that time, the people who are making decisions, the real estate professionals, it's showing you this is how they think the world looks in 1937 or 1938, 39. And so just persistence is going to leave you with a whole bunch of segregation 50 years later in a lot of these cases. But it's not because of the HOLC map.
Yeah.
They had the segregation.
Yeah, so the HLC maps are just reflecting the existing reality,
right?
Not necessarily causing it, as I think is often the story that's told. This is super fascinating.
And that's the story that's often being told. Now, the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, has a much more checkered past. Okay, and
they come next.
So the Federal Housing Administration, they go in and what they do is they insure mortgages. And so because they're providing insurance, they're guaranteeing the mortgage. That means you can charge lower interest rates on the mortgage. So getting an FHA loan is a good deal. Now, the FHA in their assessor manuals, they actually have 2 or 3 clauses or whatever that say, well, you shouldn't really make mortgages in situations where you're creating a mixed neighborhood, things like that.
So there's discriminatory practice.
In the 1940s, but they do it in the 1930s. And then they create a whole different set of maps based on a different set of data, which comes from inventories that the relief programs and cities have actually been doing for property inventories around the cities. So they have block level data. And they actually literally, when they're drawing maps and trying to figure out what areas are, if you have like 4 blocks that are right together and they all have more than 10% blacks, they consider that to be a black area. And then they also divide the world based on rental rates. And so high rents, is an area over here, low rents, and then they're making decisions along those lines. They actually tell everybody what they're doing. And they actually say, come see what we're doing. We want you to see what we're doing because you want to see everything that's going on. And so if you really wanted to blame a policy group, you want to blame the FHA.
Not the HOLC.
Even with the FHA, they're only part of the story because there's all this other stuff going on. There's also, police aren't protecting blacks who move into white neighborhoods. Malcolm X's parents, their family home was burnt down when he was a kid because they moved into this neighborhood and it was mostly white. And the house got set fire and the firemen showed up and didn't put any water on
just let it burn. Yeah.
Just let it burn. And so there are all these other things going on. So there's this myth that the HOLC is causing this segregation and a big part of the cause of segregation. But in fact, they actually are doing something quite different. and they're actually much more positive for blacks. And the maps are kind of a red herring in a sense, because they're just
But
not.
this is super interesting because it's definitely not. This is definitely more of a modern day myth that, or more of a recent myth that certainly I was not aware of. What
So this is something in the
can
last
we can you give?
20 years.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Can you give us any key papers to look at on this?
Well, so
topic?
what happened is the following. So there's a guy who wrote Crabgrass Frontier in the 1980s.
Is that Kenneth T. Jackson? Is that who wrote that?
Kenneth Jackson. And so what had happened is that he was in the National Archives, and by that time, the HOLC maps were no longer confidential. Okay, and so he actually had access to it, and he saw the red, and you've seen the term redlining. Okay, and so he says, well, these could be, and he was careful. He said these could be the source of that term redlining, and this is the nature of this. And so people started looking at this, but they really didn't have access. They didn't go in and look at the maps. And then Amy Hillier, who's at a school in Philadelphia, she may be at Penn, and so she did a study of Philadelphia, and she found, look, the HOLC doesn't look like that they were discriminating in the way that Jackson says they might have been. And then what happens is, actually, I discovered these maps myself at the National Archives in around 2006 or 2007. We actually got an NSF grant to actually collect information from all the area descriptions. And then it took us a long time to put the area descriptions into data sets and stuff, but we never did much of the mapping. In the meantime, this group in Richmond actually went and got the maps, and they digitized the maps. And so what's happened in the last 15 years is there's been an explosion of studies that say, here's the HOLC maps, and that, the high dollar areas are green, the next areas are blue, then it's yellow, then it's red. And so they said, if we look at these redlined areas in the 1930s and look at them today, they tend to be worse areas, or they tend to be areas where there's more blacks and more immigrants and things like this. There's more trashy stuff and all sorts of things along those lines. And so some people were not very careful, and they said, well, the HOLC used these maps and made their loans. Well, that was totally false. And so a number of people have been doing this, looking at this. So there's, let's see.
Isn't there a Schertzer paper on this, or no?
Schertzer's my co-author on one of these papers, actually. So Allison and I did this study along with Randy Walsh and Jessica LaVoice. And Jessica is at Bowdoin in Maine, and Randy is at Pitt. And Allison was at Pitt at the time we wrote the paper, where we look at what the segregation looked like before the maps and what it looked like right after. That's why I know that it's very similar. And then we showed that, generally the areas, if you look at these areas, the redlined areas, they actually account for about 50% of the population in a lot of these cities. Okay, and then you read the area descriptions, and they're talking about, well, these are areas where the housing values are lower, they have less amenities, they're more likely to have unpaved roads, they're unzoned, and all sorts of others like this. But there also are areas where most of the black population live, a number of immigrant populations live, and a lot of relief workers or relief population. Okay, and so you can see there's the possibility for discrimination along those lines. And so, but there are a lot of reasons why people are in those areas. But another feature that, because it's 50% of the population, the red areas are 85% white. And so what you can see is the further into
sorry. So you said the red areas are 85% white?
Yes. Because if you think about this, because the black population is only 10% of the total population. Okay. And so when you're, they're focused in this one area, in these red areas, well, that means that, the white population is 90%. And so you squeeze them down into the 50% there, and you end up being about 85%.
85%. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
And so the red areas include a large number of whites. Now, a number of those whites are immigrants and things like this. So there's still potential for discrimination of being a driving force, but there are all these other factors as well. And the discrimination is not necessarily because of the HOLC. The discrimination could be they got stuck in segregated schools or bad schools when they were a kid. They have much lower incomes. As a result, they're discriminated against at work. They have the covenants. They have all these other things like this. So there's a long, long list of things
of what's causing the segregation.
But they're not discrimination by the HOLC. It's discrimination by other people.
So
and
this is,
if you think about it, people do like to live with other people where they're like them. So and so that's
there's also like individual choice. So there's a number of issues driving this. This is a bit of a so this is a bit of tangent. We don't have that much more time. but I am interested in, okay, we have like basically segregation is going up from 1900 to 1930. HOLC comes in, they give a bunch of, they buy up a bunch of loans,
Right. And they don't change the segregation. They don't.
Right. And
they
they sort of draw these maps that are sort of literally just trying to reflect the conditions that
right.
are existing.
And the maps are drawn after they do all their lending.
And so the argument is that, and then segregation doesn't go up from 1930 that much from 1930 to 1940s. This story that they drew these maps, made discriminatory loans, then that drove more segregation. This doesn't seem to match the data. The one question I have is, how did the HOLC decide which loans to buy?
So that part we don't know. And so they still might have discriminated. So they turned down 800,000 loans. And so we don't know what the loans look like that they turned down. Now, my expectation is that probably black borrowers were more likely to be getting foreclosed on than white borrowers, just because we know from other information that blacks were more likely to become unemployed during this period. You know, they were oftentimes the last people coming into the city, and so they're the first ones fired and things like that. So the fact that the HOLC is holding more loans could be partly because there were more blacks who were in trouble relative to other people.
I see. So ultimately, we observe that their portfolio has more black borrowers than other banks, but this could be just a function of the type of loans that they were exposed to.
But it's important to note, though, but they're still actually buying up these loans and refinancing these for a significant number of blacks. So they still could have been discriminating. If
they still could have been discriminating, we just don't know.
We can't tell because we don't know how many blacks were in the 800,000 loans that got turned down. And so so it's not perfect in this. My main point about this is that the HOLC maps are actually very valuable as a picture of what real estate professionals thought the world looked like in 1937. And so if all you think about is just the persistence of this situation,
right, and
you're going to end
you're going to end up with
occurring.
because if you tend to go back in time, neighborhoods tend to persist. I mean, we sort of have this picture today of neighborhoods changing, gentrification, this sort of thing, but many of your nice neighborhoods stay your nice neighborhoods. If you go back in time, and a lot of this is actually, if you go really far back in time, this is driven by sewage systems. Like, this is why all the nice neighborhoods are the hills.
Exactly.
It's because poop runs downhill, and so you want to be on the top of the hill. Exactly. So, but I want to, there's not much time left, but I guess I want to get back to just if we could just do a big picture Great Depression in terms of
the A, B, C, D, E. Okay.
No, I want to go even bigger. Maybe we can come back to categorizing all the programs at some point, but like, what ended the Great Depression? Because this is the big thing you hear about. So you have different stories for what ended the Great Depression. So you have one story that is the New Deal ends the Great Depression. You're saying, okay, it's a mixed bag. Some things may have helped with the recovery. Another story is World War II ends the Great Depression, that ultimately the war buildup is what pulls out. A third story, I think, favored by people like monetary policy aficionados, would be it's the gold standard. And that ultimately when FDR gets us off the gold standard, that stops the deflation and sort of spurs the recovery. So of these three stories, can you give us sort of what you think?
So this is more complicated. So there's the monetarist and the gold standard stories kind of go together to some extent. And so that's Barry Eichengreen and actually Peter Temin a little bit before him. But Barry's probably the primary gold standard guy.
But Bernanke too. Is Bernanke not this guy?
Well, Bernanke actually doesn't talk as much about the gold standard. So Eichengreen is the one who wrote the book that really focused on the gold standard. So Bernanke wrote a bunch about the Great Depression. In fact, he actually was one of the people who recognized the thing about the hours work that I was talking about. And he
should just talk to my great grandpa. He should have just, my great grandpa recognized it.
So anyway, so what happens is that if you look at the timing, every country, when they go off the gold standard, actually tends to recover after that period. Is that causal? Hard to say for sure. Is that the cause? I don't know. It's a really strong correlation. And some people have tried to test the causality of it, and they seem to think that at least their tests seem to suggest it's partially causal. I mean, does it explain everything? Probably not. Okay, so that helps. So what we do with monetary policy helps. What we do with public works and relief helps. What we do with the HOLC helps. You know, we haven't even talked about like 25 other programs that were going on at the same time.
I'm gonna have you back on. I'm gonna have you back on, and we'll do the tier list. Okay.
Okay. But the one thing about it is you need to think about this a little bit though. So, because people say too slow, too fast. That was part of what the story was, the macroeconomists we were talking about earlier. But think about this. Great Depression, real GDP falls by 30% in 4 years. We get back up to in per capita GDP gets back up to the level it was at in 1929, 4 years later in 1937. Okay. Now, if you want to get back to the long-term growth path, it takes until 1941. Now, think about the Great Recession. That's 2007, 2008, 2009, things like that. Right? Real GDP falls by 4% from 2007 to 2009, which is much smaller. They don't recover to the 2007 level until 2013, which is it 2012? 2012.
So 5-6 years later. Okay.
Well, no, 3 years later. Okay, so you had a 4% drop. You recovered to the previous level in 3 years. Compared to the Depression, you had a 30% drop, and they recovered to the previous level in 4 years. Now, that seems pretty quick to me. Now, the problem for the Great Depression is then we have another recession.
In 1937, right?
In 1937 and 1938, cop things. And so we get back up to the 1929 level again in 1939. And then so by 1941, though, we are actually at a pace where between 1929 and 1941, the average annual growth rate in per capita income was 2%, because there was a huge surge of income in 1941 before we entered the war.
Okay, so I think we can sort of throw out World War II as an explanation
to
for
some
ending
extent.
the
I mean, now partly we're not in the war yet, okay, but we're doing Lend-Lease and we're actually kind of preparing for the war and all sorts of things like that. But there was a real surge in 1941. So is it too slow or too fast? I mean, it's kind of tricky in this kind of thing. But I mean, if you think about a drop in the 30s, but it's like 7 times bigger than the drop that occurred in the Great Recession, and it only takes them a year longer to get back to the previous peak. That's pretty damn fast, actually, in these kind of things. It's not as fast as what Lee Ohanian and Hal Cole thought that should have been. But another way to think about it is actually a bigger way of thinking about it, which is the political economy of everything that's going on. Think about what's going on in Europe and all these countries during this period, during these depressions. I mean, most of them are turning into fascist hellholes with authoritarian government. Italy, Germany, Japan, China, Hungary, a long list of things. We did not become a fascist hellhole, although there are extreme conservatives at the time who thought that Roosevelt was a fascist. But we actually stayed away from a lot of that stuff. And so in that sense,
there was a coup. Wasn't there an attempted coup against Roosevelt too? Weren't they trying to enlist like Smedley Butler to like try to overthrow him? I don't know.
This one I don't know about. So yeah, I have to go.
Oh, you don't know this one? Oh, okay. All right.
No, you can tell me about it because I haven't heard about that one. Roosevelt worried about.
I believe there were some businessmen who were trying to oust Roosevelt and install a General Smedley Butler in his place.
The good news is they didn't succeed, so we still maintained their democracy.
That's what I'm saying. They might have gone that way.
That's right. That's right. It could have gone that way. Potentially, that's why So in that sense, whatever.
And you could have gone the other way. I mean, you sort of could have gone the other way, where Roosevelt like nationalizes everything, and the U.S. becomes like socialist or something.
That was the other way that people went during that time frame or whatever. Is they're nationalizing things and things along those lines. And so we didn't do that either. So we provided Social Security. Federal government for the first time gets involved in providing local relief and relief to people and things along those lines. And so we started going down this path of providing more in the way of social insurance and things along those lines than we did. And, we regulated banks to a much greater extent than we had before. And there was a lot of different changes going on, but we were still a capitalist economy and much more capitalist than any place you can name in Europe during this time frame. And so in that sense, even though you've got these guys who hate Roosevelt and think he's a total fascist and stuff, and a socialist and communist or whatever, they're not really right. But the New Deal, partly thing is the New Deal, there's so much uncertainty about what's going on that slowed things down to some extent. But depending on how you look at it, where I compare what's going on in the Great Recession to what's going on in the 1930s, I'm going, wow, only 1 year longer to get back to the previous level. That's actually much better than I thought in this kind of situations. Anyway, that's my thoughts about this. And so I'm sure people will
it's funny because No. It's and I would say in academic circles, Roosevelt is regarded as like one of the great presidents.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and then
Even I'm a
if
conservative,
I
and a libertarian, and even I consider him to be a great president because he did all sorts of things. I
well,
don't
no,
agree
but it
with
also
everything
in
he
liber-
did.
but in general in libertarian circles, it's like he's the absolute worst president. He's like you should have him as the worst one.
That's
And
right. Well, I'm a
sort of
half-caste
my
libertarian, I guess.
no, well, my response to those people is exactly what you said is like what are we comparing to? Like if you compare to the other countries around the world, like the other countries either go extreme fascist or extreme socialist, and the U.S. sort of stays this middle path. And Roosevelt should be given a lot of credit for keeping the U.S. from going either direction. And also generally, I think whatever whatever the word you want to use, I want to use the word vibes. Like I think you should give him a lot of credit for the vibes. Like he's giving people hope, he's giving people inspiration. And part of all these New Deal programs, obviously, as we've covered, some worked, some were counterproductive, but it gives the impression that, hey, we're trying, hey, we're in this together, we're trying to do something here. So
And it helped a lot of people who were in bad shape. I mean, that's what the key with the public works and relief we're doing. I mean, one of the striking things I think is those demographic features about cutting death rates, infant mortality rates, and things like that. Also, crime rates were lower as a result of the New Deal programs too. Yeah, so I mean, it's really a mixed bag. People ask me, "Well, was the New Deal successful?" Well, which part is a pretty good answer to that question. And so, you should have me on to talk about the World War II and what was going on with World War II, because people think that World War II was this big Keynesian stimulus. And my thesis advisor, Bob Higgs, convinced me a long time ago that was wrong, that we had a tremendous sacrifice during World War II to win that war. It was worth it.
Yeah. I think I've read a couple Bob Higgs paper on that. And also you just need to talk to people who lived through World War II as well to understand what it was a big sacrifice in terms of
look at the toy and it was a sock,
yeah, exactly. And what people gave up in terms of, if you look at like recipes from the time, it's like take the sock and put it into a stew, and that's right. That's your meal.
That's right.
Well, I think I definitely want to have you back on to talk about a number of topics. It's probably a good place to wrap up, but maybe if you could recommend, either one book or one piece of literature from the time that sort of represents it, or people
one
should
book
take
from
a
the
look
time. Okay. Oh, that's a good
question. Either you can recommend an academic book or just like, I don't know, like a movie or I don't know, something that people might want to check out to give them a sense of what the Great Depression was like.
Yeah, that's a tough one. However, if I really want to get across the stuff we've done on the New Deal, I'd recommend the Journal of Economic Literature article.
All right. Well, those are actually very readable. So,
right,
and also,
that's true. And so,
I would say it's so much easier to read papers these days. I'll take a paper and throw it into ChatGPT and ask a bunch of questions.
Exactly.
You could take
really fast.
You could take that paper and throw it into ChatGPT and say, "Hey, so what does it tell about this? What does it talk about this?" And it's
I should do that. And just put it on my website.
Yeah, have the conversation.
Good idea. Actually, you come up with all sorts of good ideas. This is great.
All right. This is not from the Great Depression, but I don't know if I recently watched the movie Christmas Story. Have you watched Christmas Story?
Yeah. That was a building alone. No, the Christmas Story. Oh, that's a wonderful movie.
Not It's a Wonderful Life. A Christmas Story. Well, I guess It's a Wonderful Life would be a classic Great Depression, but A Christmas Story I think is set in the late 40s.
Yeah. It's awesome.
I watched it with my son recently, who's 8, and he was shocked by how hard life was. He was like, "Oh my gosh, these people, what is going on? Like, they got this furnace," and he's like, "How come everybody is mean? Everyone is so mean to each other."
I remember that movie came out because it was
early 80s. It came out, but it's
early 80s came out. I saw it. I was at the University of Georgia, and I was at like the university theater. And I was laughing so hard, I almost bit the chair in front of me. That is the truly greatest movie of all time for Christmas. And they show it on, I think it's TNT or TBS. They show it for 24 hours running on Christmas Eve.
Yeah. Well,
so
I actually only saw it when I watched it with my son was the first time I had seen it, because as a kid I looked exactly like the main character and everyone would make fun of me for looking exactly like the main character, so I avoided it in protest.
Yeah, so you shoot your eye out. So that scene where the Santa Claus is shoving his foot in his face, saying you shoot your eye out.
Yeah.
Down the slide is just a classic.
Uh,
So I
all
won't
right.
go to
Well,
grocery
thanks for
store.
yeah, thanks for coming on. We'll have you back on at some point to talk through
Okay,
some of the
that's
stuff we
great.
didn't
Well,
have.
thanks for having me. This has been a blast.
So I hope you enjoyed that talk. If you're interested in looking at more of Price Fishback's work, I will link his Journal of Economic Literature article. And then also, he edited a book called Government, A New History, which sort of profiles the history of the role of government in the US economy. Both I highly recommend. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week.